Where am I? All right, I think we're gonna start. Warm welcome to everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today the event of Transdisciplinary Trauma Studies Roundtable. And depending on where you are joining us from, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Magdalena Zolkos. I am Associate Professor in the Department of Social Sciences and Philosophy at Jyväskylä University in central Finland, and I am moderating the event. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank for technical assistance to Lorena Ortiz Cabrero. And I'm going to introduce the panel just by saying first that we have four distinguished speakers whom I will introduce in greater detail. This is the plan for today. And then before we move to the panel, I'm going to give the floor to Anna Manihurt, who will introduce you to a newly established book series that sort of parallels this event. And then we're going to come back and I will introduce the panel and then we're going to start. So without further ado, I will introduce the panelists and that will be in the order of their speaking. The first of our panelists today is going to be Anna Manihurt, who is a professor of trauma studies at the Budapest University of Jewish Studies. She's an academic researcher, teacher, and a writer with an expertise in many fields, comparative literature, critical theory, and relevant specifically for today, memory and trauma studies, as well as gender. She's held positions and fellowships at Wiesenthal Institute in Vienna, at the University of Amsterdam as Marie Skłodowska-Curie Individual Research Fellow, and prior to that, she was a principal investigator of the Trauma and Gender in Literature and Culture Research Group. She's the author of Women's Literary Tradition and 20th Century Hungarian Women Writers, published by Brill last year, and Trauma and Literature, Comparative Case Studies from the Hungarian Perspective. Our second panelist in the order of speaking is Annie Jones-Stark, who is an assistant professor of history, and she's also the chair of the Department of Philosophy, History, and Politics at Thompson Rivers University, Kamloops in British Columbia in Canada. Her areas of specialization include British and English history, as well as memory and trauma studies, and she will speak to us in that capacity. But in regard to the latter, her research, her teaching, and her publications have focused on history of civilian and military responses to war and in war, history of emotions, affect, and catastrophe, and history of PTSD and mental illness. Our third panelist is Nicola Mccortic, who is postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Communication and Media Sciences at University of Bern in Switzerland, where he is one of the researchers on the project on populist radical right attitudes and political information behavior. Trauma and memory studies is one of his areas of specialization, and he combines his research on trauma with critical security studies, cybersecurity communication, digital sciences, and propaganda studies. His many publications include articles in memory studies, in Continuum, and in media, war, and conflict. And recently he contributed a chapter to the Palgrave Handbook of Digital Russia Studies. And then last but definitely not least, our fourth speaker is Fiona Temomo, who is Associate Professor in Development Studies in the School of Maori Knowledge at Massey University in Aotearoa, New Zealand. She's a Maori Indigenous scholar, a researcher, and a teacher, and the focus of her work is development of Indigenous knowledge. She has established a broad and multifaceted expertise in Maori development that stretches across social, economic, and community development, as well as Maori cultural knowledge, community compassion, and volunteer work. Recently, she has co-edited 2 volumes of an oral and traditional history report that documents communal, historical, and contemporary narrative of Ngati Raukawa peoples. She's written prolifically as well, contributing chapters and articles, including Canadian Journal of Native Education and Journal of Social Work on decolonizing social work. So welcome to our 4 panelists. And before we move on to the panel, I'm going to invite Anna now to speak and introduce the book series.
Okay, thank you. So I will try to share my screen. So this is a book series, a new book series called Transdisciplinary Trauma Studies. And we co-edited with Annie St. John Stark and Nicola Mccortic. And we invite submissions of books from any field which is related in some way to trauma. So this is the kind of transdisciplinarity that we envisage for this series. And I will talk about this approach at the end of my own talk. But for now, I would like to say that please go to this website, look it up at the Gruyter. This is a new series. And in any field that you work in might be interesting for us. We would like to establish a series which looks at trauma from a new viewpoint, from not isolated viewpoint of different fields, but from a viewpoint from which every field can contribute to the understanding of trauma, but that does not necessarily mean that we have to encompass the whole field as we are trauma scholars. But there is this approach which legitimizes coming to talk about or studying trauma from different viewpoints. I understand from some comments we received that this is not always self-explanatory. So that's why I would like to emphasize it here as well. Okay.
Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah. All right. Thanks very much, Anna. So now, without further delay, I would like us to start with the panel. And just as a way of introduction of how we're going to proceed, I'm going to give the floor in the order in which I introduce the panelists, and everybody will speak for about 10 minutes. And afterwards, we are going to open the floor. So we welcome people's comments, participants' comments, we welcome interventions, and we hope for a lively discussion. All right, so why don't we start back to Anna now with your 10 minutes intervention, please.
I'm very sorry, I'm alone with my daughter. She's just climbing on the floor because she's like a well-disciplined child of an academic, but she's just here. But I will start with my talk, okay? Okay, so what I will do now, because we had some preliminary discussions with the speakers about this event, and anyway, it was a long time ago when we originally planned it, so some things have changed in the meantime, or newer ideas came up. So I will split my talk into 2 parts. The first part is going to be what it would have been originally, my own research, trauma in the digital age, and in the second part, I will talk about transdisciplinarity in science and the transdisciplinarity of studying trauma. And I hope this will not make it into a very mixed talk, or and please comment in the comment session on both parts. Okay, so my own research is in digital trauma studies. This is a new field, which I named it as such, and started research on it like 6 years ago. Before that, I researched trauma in literature and in cultural studies. And then I came to studying the impact of the digital environment on trauma, including individual, collective, and historical trauma. And this research concentrates on how social media networks since the 2000s have introduced major changes in the way people are exposed to traumatic content. So if you look at your Facebook or your Twitter, you will see your friends, and on the next page you will see something very difficult, something which you wouldn't necessarily come across if you just switch on TV or open a newspaper. This is a totally different presence of the traumatic in our lives. And there is also a political angle to it, that social media provide information in cases when state-run media do not cover issues. So this can mean that there is a secondary traumatization of the viewers, but social media also offer new ways of dealing with trauma, also historical trauma. By this, I study also how transgenerational and intergenerational trauma can be resolved in social media groups, and what kind of political consequences can be of these new approaches. I call it frozen currents, when trauma layer after trauma layer block progression in cultural memory, and especially the region of Eastern and Central Europe. The numerous unresolved collective traumas have a huge impact on how people are still in an intergenerationally traumatized state in many regions. And this is how, for example, Western European and Eastern European approaches to historical trauma differ, because in Eastern Europe, it's much more characteristic to see how intensive digitization is in terms of memory debates and also trauma processing. And so my research has three hypotheses, which I will introduce now here. So the first one is online platforms prompt a shift from pre-digital silence around trauma to digital trauma processing via sharing. And for this, I need to explain how silence surrounds trauma. So in cultural trauma studies in the 1990s, the element of silence was considered crucial to trauma. In trauma theories, there is primary traumatization, how the victims are not able to talk about the trauma due to various reasons, shame, or even neurobiological changes in the brain. The secondary traumatization is caused by indifference. It's a way of silencing by others. It's how, for example, Holocaust survivors arrived back to their home countries, and the people there, they just didn't take account of what happened to them. And it is again a layer of traumatization. It is because also it is very difficult to listen to the trauma of others because of the potential vicarious traumatization that can happen if people are not trained, so to say, not trained to the way you can listen to the trauma of another person. So there is empathy and indifference, and there is a way to listen to the trauma of others, but it carries the danger of being traumatized. And at the third level, these reactions can be combined with tabooing in totalitarian regimes, with political silencing. What I study is how digital media have the potential to redefine trauma in online communities and on social media platforms, because of the possibility of instant response, the dialogue, sharing, and commenting, which counteracts silence and keeps victims from being isolated. And the second hypothesis is that social media offer ways to diminish the indifference that causes secondary traumatization. This is a bit of a tricky issue, but the wall of indifference that would lead to secondary traumatization will not be built on social media. those unable to comment or to recognize the trauma of the other will remain silent, but the silence will not be noticeable online, because this kind of turning away, the not listening to others, that in real life has the effect of bringing on secondary trauma, will not be noticeable on social media. So people just will not comment, but not commenting is not something that people notice. So this is might be a bit of an illusion, but still it can help when people who get together, they want to comment, and those comments are normally helpful. Yes, we have trolls, but then it's these kind of straightforward attacks are easier to counteract from the side of a victim than the silence and the turning away. Okay, and the third hypothesis is about digital bystanders. This is my current research, how bystanders become the carrier group of trauma. Normally, trauma grids used in psychotherapy include the victim, perpetrator, bystander, and collaborator. But bystanders are a very difficult group to catch, to understand. They are not, for example, in Holocaust research, there is not a lot of archival materials about bystanders. It's a huge mess. By number, it's the greatest group of people who were concerned, but still we don't know about them. But still, these people were traumatized in some way, and they are carrying this burden through the generations. What I do is I compare this with digital bystanders. This is becoming like a common concept. We are all, in a sense, digital bystanders, because we watch the trauma of others and we just don't do anything. We are not able to do anything, but we are meeting all this traumatic content all the time. There are ways, for example, there are online trainings for countering bystander passivity. So there are newer and newer ways of dealing with bystanding. Okay, and this is my table about the differences of understanding trauma pre-digital and post-digital, and how trauma was once fixed in time and space. And just please have a look. And today, digital trauma processing, trauma shared online on social media, sharing eliminates silence and allows for plural and multiplied versions of traumatic history. And I think I have like 2 or 3 minutes left. Is it so? Yeah. So normally I would show my case studies, or at least one case study, like the Holocaust Facebook groups dealing with Holocaust, But just here you can see what I do. And I would like to go to transdisciplinarity from now on. So I looked up 2 articles which were very definitive, like a very long time ago, 1991. This is the first article by Marlene Stamber, which explains, maybe, I'm sorry if it's very basic, but I think it's good to go back to the basics. So what interdisciplinary, within one discipline, cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, that is the most common, actually. Even when we talk about interdisciplinarity, it's normally just multidisciplinarity. So it's the integration. Interdisciplinary is integration of the contributions, and transdisciplinary is a higher level of integrated study concerned with the unity of frameworks beyond disciplinary perspective. This is a bit difficult to understand. I can see that. But the situation that this article talks about in 1991 has not changed so much, because she says here, by serving very useful purposes, academic disciplines create barriers. So when the framework itself becomes barrier to the topic, the framework studies, then it's a problem. And the second article is 10 years later. It's on transdisciplinarity by Hugh and Mitterstrass. So like he here responds to some criticism, which according to the criticism, people think that transdisciplinary is kind of holistic and above the sciences, but he proves that it's not. But it also says that transdisciplinary carries with itself the potential to change the system. So it's a kind of cooperation which results in a lasting and systemic order that alters the disciplinary order itself. Whereas the previous layers of scientific research do not have this potential. And he also talks about how a system or the order which is laid out can become rigid and can hinder actually research. So what I want to say that and how we envisage the book series also. So for me, transdisciplinarity in trauma studies means the focus on providing context between fields and disciplines, how one field can provide a context for another one, and how the approach focusing on linking points and relations between approaching. So basically, it's a kind of networking approach because the basis of this is that the discipline, the framework is in a specific relationship with the topic. So we can see the topic through the lenses of the framework, but the topic impacts the framework too. So in trauma studies, it's very important to be focus on linking and connections, because the topic, the trauma, isolates and it is surrounded by silence. Transdisciplinary connects, links, and builds network. So trauma transmission will not possibly happen so much because now there is increasingly talk about the traumatization of researchers who study traumatic materials and how difficult this is. But if it's an approach which focuses on linking and not on isolation, which allows for dialogue in a very emphatic way, then it can help. So before the last sentence, so I received some reviews about grants and proposals and also articles, and I've seen comments which say, oh, how great this is, but the researchers should be back to memory studies, and digital media studies is a completely different issue. And yes, okay, but this is not media studies, that is okay, not memory studies. So, the current policy is to invite interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research, but the acceptance is not so high. I think the level of acceptance of those endeavors is not so high. But I think trauma studies can be a transdisciplinary hub science, which involves a shift in a theoretical perspective. And we can move from isolated disciplines studying trauma towards an integrative hub science. Yeah. And so sorry about this mixture of talks. And if someone is interested, please read my articles, which have some material on the talk I had originally had in mind. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anna. And thank you for keeping to the time. This is really great. So without, why don't we just move straight to the second speaker? Annie, please take the floor, the virtual floor.
Virtual floor. I like that. All right, let me share my screen. Where am I? There it is. There we go. All right, let me start with that. There we go. Hope that works. Oh, it did work. Yay. I'm still amazed at the technology. This is just still mind-blowing to me. All right, hello everyone. I am speaking to you from Kamloops, British Columbia. So I am starting out with an acknowledgement of the territory on which I am situated, which is the unceded lands of the Tk'emwach te Shakpormik And I'm grateful for living in this beautiful place. So let me acknowledge that first and then move on. My PowerPoint is not nearly as polished as Anna's. She does such a beautiful job. So I'll just start with just quickly introducing where I'm at presently with the transdisciplinarity and trauma. I'm coming at this as a historian. My original work up till about 5 years ago was on conscience and allegiance in the English Civil War. And in that context of studying that, I certainly spent some time looking at casuistry, a process of determining right action. And then I realized that I was looking at the survivors of Civil War in England of the 17th century. And looking at their survivorship, I became really quite curious about how they managed to survive and what they thought survival was. I'm aware that I'm using a 21st century framing for this, certainly, in thinking of survivorship. That's not something that they would have, I think, come up with. Certainly, it would have been completely anachronistic for them, but I'm still curious. So over time, I was aware that my interest in their ability to make some sort of sense of what they had endured, perhaps as prisoners of war during this really quite violent civil war, or victors, or someone that just barely survived. I became aware that when I was looking at them, I was also situated myself in a time when there was ongoing and continues to be persistent traumatic events, catastrophes, disasters, violence in the form of genocide and torture and imprisonment and natural disasters, as we call them, everything from Hurricane Katrina in 2005 to the tsunami in Indonesia to 9/11 in the United States to civil wars in Europe. The list, as we know, is quite endless. So having been someone who also deals and has continued to deal with traumatic effects in my own life from part of my youth, it was really something that seemed a natural fit to look at trauma historically, being aware of the challenges there, but also being aware of the current realities of trauma and traumatic exposure over time. So to jump forward, at this very moment, I'm finishing up a grant proposal for a trauma studies conference here in British Columbia to take place next year. And so in this short amount of time I have with you, I'm going to briefly refer to a challenge that arose with that, and then introduce you a bit more to my own research on heroes and trauma. In the first place, in just constructing this grant proposal, I'm sure many here listening and watching have tried to and attempted to write grant proposals successfully or not successfully. There's a unique circumstance that certainly has arisen in putting this together, in that it's a transdisciplinary conference. So it's intentionally one that does not fit into a neat category in one discipline, one area of study. So one enormous challenge has been fascinating and rewarding, but it's that I have had to build relationship outside of the liberal arts to expand as much as possible into other fields of study at my own university, to articulate transdisciplinarity and the benefits of that in a way that a government or federal level adjudicators, which is the agency to which we're applying, would understand and would appreciate and would be able to conceive the value of this. In a way, as Anna was saying, this is clearly an attempt to change the system of knowledge, the epistemology really of trauma, because there are so many different facets we're attempting to bring together in the context of this conference, everything from history to social work, to sociology, to the medical field, to the arts. So really, it's been a challenge just articulating this to those who aren't familiar with trauma studies, transdisciplinary trauma studies, digital trauma studies. So that's a significant challenge. There was also a challenge because of the geographic location in which we're situated. Some of you might be familiar with some of the recent findings in Canada of unmarked graves on the sites of former residential schools. It's part of Canadian history, certainly, but primarily part of the Indigenous history here. So in that context, it seemed acutely necessary to continue with an existing plan to have this conference on trauma studies, involving trauma studies, but also trying to build this conference and build the relationships also meant trying to delicately acknowledge and create opportunities for us to reach out to Indigenous communities throughout our region and throughout Canada because of the trauma that they've experienced. So it's been a very delicate process, and there's a great potential here to go forward in many ways. So that's been quite a challenge. There's one key challenge is trying to bridge the gap between the arts and the sciences, to bring them in and allow creative, not even allow, that seems like we possess it, but we don't, to create opportunities where people can and disciplines can articulate where they're at with trauma and trauma studies. So it's been fascinating. I'm crossing my fingers, as we do here in Canada, that we have a good outcome with this. All right, so, and I'd appreciate comments for sure later on. All right, so my own interest, Heroes and Trauma. This is a 17th century text, the Soldier's Catechism. And when I think of the heroic narratives that informed men, particularly of the 17th century and later, I think of these examples. A Soldier's Catechism is a great example. I really am interested in what we would call, and what many historians and trauma studies scholars have called, a master narrative. I'm sure Anne is familiar with that in looking at some of the literature and biographical statements comprising narratives surrounding trauma. One argument is that there is this master narrative culturally, and it informs everyone of the expectations of trauma, not of trauma, of heroic action. What is the appropriate action? In military circumstances, this prevails today, certainly. The Soldier's Catechism of 1644 was very well known for many reasons. The early part of this particular pamphlet takes the reader through what the perceptions they should have of the enemy, right? So this is a largely parliamentarian viewpoint. There are two sides of the English Civil War, the parliamentary side and then the royalist side. So while this may be of one side, the narrative is the same for both sides, because they're all part of English culture. So what is really interesting is that these texts that come out in the context of a civil war echo earlier texts coming out of the Renaissance period in Europe, all the way back to the early medieval period. The expectations are generally the same. Let's see if I can move you over here. Yeah. So we know that some of what comes out of the Soldier's Catechism is the expectation that a soldier be courageous and valiant. I'm just reading from a little bit later in that text, that he be skillful in the military profession, that he adhere to scripture, the Christian scripture, stop, what is that? And that he be ready to fight to the death. So those are some of the ingredients, right? But we also get master narratives in the modern context. The First World War, this very famous poem in Flanders Fields by John McCrae, take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw, the torch be yours to hold it high. So those who died in the context of the First World War, the English soldiers, those who died were effectively throwing a torch to the survivors with the expectation. So Magdalena, am I done? Am I out of time?
You write on 10 minutes, but
okay, I will stop.
I don't want to, if you wanted to wrap up.
I will wrap up.
And abruptly, by all means, yeah.
Okay, I will wrap up for sure. So the expectation then is of heroes that they catch the torch. They capture the expectations, and they move forward heroically as well. What I'm quite interested in is that these individuals that are expected to capture the heroic actions and carry forward with them go forward into our current time period. So recently in the United States, within the past 4 or 5 years, there have been quite dramatic and violent events of mass shootings. And have been interested in the responses of those. So these two posts come from social media, right? They're from Facebook, they're from Reddit, REDIT. And these are people who witnessed and who were present at, in this case, particularly a mass shooting that took place in 2017 in Las Vegas, Nevada. What I'm interested in here, of course, is that the traumatic event is a perpetual thing, right? In the left, this person is still situated within the actual events. PTSD, one aspect of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, as many of you might know, is that a person is situated within that event. They may be relating the details, but while they're relating them, they're effectively reliving them. They're back in that moment. On the right, you'll see that there's a discussion in the context of people talking about that mass shooting, the hero term, right? Their own critique is that the term hero is thrown around way too much, and it's dumb, right? So my query and my focus is on whether those individuals who are assigned the label of hero, whether they actually can ever integrate that into their own self-definition, their own sense of who they are and what they are. My argument is that trauma shortcuts that. Trauma in its effects and its reality guarantees that someone who is a survivor, and perhaps someone who acted in a way we would consider heroic in the moment, trauma guarantees that that person does not absorb all the aspects that come from the master narrative of heroism. It prevents that. It's a wall. It's a block. And I'll stop there because there's so much more I could say, and I know I'm over time. So thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Thanks so much, Annie. I want to just go to that conference next year just to hear you give a paper on this, because it's been absolutely fascinating. I'll be the fly on the wall, you know?
Okay.
All right. So we're going to move to our third panelist. Nicola, please come on in.
Yes, thank you, Magdalena. Let me share my screen. So, as Magdalena already noted, I'm going to talk today about the information retrieval and trauma studies. And my name is Mikko. I'm from the University of Bern. And pretty much I would like to start first by actually talking how information retrieval and trauma are related, because I think that it's probably the least obvious connection among all 4 papers which are in our roundtable. It's pretty obvious how the trauma is related to the digital trauma studies, how it's related to history, and how it is related to indigenous studies and healing. But in the case of the information retrieval, there might be some confusion. So I would like to start with explaining how I see this connection. So pretty much, as Anna already noted, today we are having a situation when we're having unprecedented volume of content which is related to trauma. And pretty much it is true both for the historical trauma-related content, such as materials about the Holocaust or Holodomor or the Rwandan genocide, but also pretty much contemporary trauma-related events such as anti-Black violence in the United States. And all those materials are pretty much available via both commercial and also research-focused online platforms. It's also interesting that this unprecedented volume of content includes both content about the trauma itself, so let's say historical materials about the Holocaust or other forms of the genocide, but also suggestions about how to cope with trauma, for instance, how you actually can prevent the suicide and what you can actually do in the case you're heavily traumatized. And in the case you're interested in how the information retrieval is related to the suicide prevention, I highly recommend the great paper about one of my colleagues, Mario Haim. So in theory, what we're having is the wonderful situation when we're really having unprecedented volume of content about trauma, and this abundance of trauma-related content should actually increase trauma awareness. So we're having more content than ever before, so we're actually becoming more aware about the trauma, both in the historical dimension and also in the contemporary dimension. And potentially this abundance can also enhance coping strategies, because now we can just go to the Google, and or we can actually go to the Facebook, search there for the trauma coping strategies and say, okay, there is a way we can actually deal with the trauma. There's actually a way we can break the silence. So pretty much what Anna was actually talking during her presentation. However, the problem is that on practice, unfortunately, we're also having not only good content, so to say. We're also having a lot of problematic trauma-related content, which is pretty much really results in the constant upsurge of the denialism. We probably can think about the Holocaust denialism, but also true about the other genocides again, as well as the hate speech, which definitely doesn't help us to cope with the trauma. Unfortunately, hate speech can only amplify ignorance and also lead to re-traumatization in some cases. Now, what we're having under those conditions is pretty much a classic information retrieval problem. So we're having really plenty volume of the digital content that we actually need to prioritize and find information from. So we're having, again, what we call good content. We have what we call bad content. And ideally, we want our information retrieval, such as the Google search algorithm, for instance, to retrieve good content and prioritize it over the bad content. However, because of we actually having too much content, we unfortunately cannot do it with the help of humans only. So we cannot rely only on the human creation in this case. So we actually have to build and then deploy algorithms or the sequences of instructions which are used to fulfill a particular task. And algorithms are very intensively used both by commercial platforms such as Google or YouTube, as well as the research platforms. So you can think about, for instance, the database of the materials of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which are pretty much created by the information retrieval algorithms. So under those conditions, we pretty much having algorithmic system becoming trauma processing agents, because they effectively determine what trauma-related content users will see or will not see. So for instance, let's say if I'm searching on Google for the George Floyd murder, the Google algorithm pretty much determines what kind of information I'm getting. I'm getting information about it being an instance of racialized violence, or I'm actually getting very right-wing content about George Floyd being a criminal and all other wonderful things that you can actually find on the social media. So the question is, what are the implications of the shift? Can actually algorithms adequately cope with this task and deal with the challenges involved in the trauma curation? Pretty much, I would be really very happy to say yes, algorithms are wonderful, they can actually do this. Unfortunately, it is not all that simple, because unfortunately, we're actually having a lot of concerns about the algorithmic agency, which applied to many other areas. When we're actually deploying algorithms, you can think about the general information deployment, you can think about the news recommenders or commercial recommenders, and pretty much all those drawbacks are also very much applicable to the trauma-related content. Unfortunately, algorithmic systems are very often intransparent, they're very often driven by the commercial logic, and when you actually have a commercial logic, it raises a lot of questions to what degree it is actually applicable to highly ethically challenging tasks such as a trauma information curation. we also know that algorithms are often subject to the randomization, which makes the outputs very unpredictable. They can also propagate hate speech. They can also enclose us into the filter bubble. So basically the information bubbles when we're actually getting only specific perspective on the certain event or the certain subject. For instance, you can think about the Holocaust denialist filter bubble. Algorithms can also undermine authority of the research institution as well as traumatize individuals who actually want to communicate their trauma via the digital platforms. Again, what Anna was noting in her talk. Unfortunately, we're also having a problem with algorithmic system and platforms using them pretty often struggling with the lack of accountability. It's really very hard to hold Google or Facebook accountable, even while they're often doing very morally dubious things. And finally, they can also breach our individual and collective rights, both in terms of getting the reliable information and, for instance, also attacking the dignity of the victims. So pretty much all those reasons motivate us to study algorithmic agency. And there are actually different ways of doing so. So in the field of the information retrieval, there are different approaches to studying how algorithms actually create information. We can often rely on the crowdsourcing. We can also rely on the manual querying and API requests. But what we're actually doing with our team in Bern, Zurich, and Gezes is we're actually building robots which simulate human browsing behavior in order to generate certain inputs and also record outputs. Why we're actually relying on the robot building? Because there are several reasons. Robots are definitely not getting tired or traumatized when they're actually exposed to the traumatic content. Unfortunately, people often get traumatized when they actually work with the traumatic content, and so people also getting tired very fast. Also, the memory of our robots is definitely much better than, for instance, my memory. I definitely would exchange my memory for the memory of the robot in many cases. And finally, robots can also be easily controlled, so we can actually study a lot of aspects of the algorithmic creation, such as personalization or randomization of the outputs, and then actually prove, okay, for instance, if my gender is female, then I'm getting certain set of trauma-related outputs on Google, which are different from the cases when my gender, for instance, is male. So our current focus of what we are doing is pretty much web search, so pretty much the search engines, as well as the recommender systems used by commercial platforms, both in the West and also in the non-Western context. And in particular, we are focusing on the Holocaust-related content, but we're also having several upcoming projects which expand to the other historical and contemporary traumas. And in the rest of my talk, I will just show you very briefly some examples of what we are doing, and then I will briefly talk about the transdisciplinary challenges which are actually struggling with. So it is one of the projects that we are running last year. So pretty much here we looked at what we call the Commendation Trajectories. So pretty much what we did for this project, we actually built two robots which actually love to watch recommended videos on the YouTube. And basically our robots start with the same educational video about the Auschwitz concentration camp. And then we actually telling our robots, okay, please go to the very top first recommended video and keep doing it for 100 steps. What we can actually see on this nice, colorful graph is, first of all, that between our two robots, one of which was deployed in the Chrome browser and another was deployed in the Firefox browser, there is very, very little similar trajectories that they share. Basically, they just share two very first recommendations. And then after this very first recommendations, their paths are radically diverging, which again kind of brings us back to the whole point about the randomization of the algorithmic systems, and also raises questions. Is it actually something that we want in the case of the educational video recommendations? Do we actually want to have the situation when our YouTube users start with the same video and then getting very, very different recommendations? Then there is also a question of what exactly are the recommendations they're getting. For instance, our Chrome-based robot, I think already on the fifth or the fourth step, gets a recommendation of the video which is called Deadly Asbestos, which honestly has zero relationship to the Holocaust. It's basically related to the dangers of the using asbestos as a building material. And from the point of view of the algorithms, the logic is relatively simple. Holocaust is deadly, asbestos is deadly, so probably if I am interested in watching videos about the Holocaust, I also would be thrilled to watch some videos about asbestos because they're both deadly things. From the ethical point of view, as well as educational point of view, I would say it's much more complex and much more questionable. In the case of the Firefox-based robot, we're actually sticking to the Holocaust for some more time. On the similar step, we're actually still getting the Holocaust-related video, which is one of the survivors' testimonies. However, generally, we end up in both cases with video recommendations which are totally not related to the mass atrocities, unless you really hate John Travolta, as well as not related to the Holocaust from which the things actually started. Here's another example. In this particular case, we actually trained several hundreds of robots whom we actually taught to search on multiple search engines for the term Holocaust. And specifically, we looked here at the information results related to the image search. So effectively, our robots just went on the multiple search engines, specifically 6, I think we have on this slide. And then we actually asked them to search for the term Holocaust there. And then what we actually did, we actually labeled the outputs. In this case, I think we looked at specifically at first 50 outputs for each robot. And then what we're actually interested in is to what death camp actually the outputs are related to. Pretty much as we can see on the graph, there is very high disproportion in the output. So especially in the case of the Baidu, which is the largest search engine in China, we pretty much have almost all results related to one single camp, which is Auschwitz. Pretty much we're also observing the same situation on the majority of other search engines. It again raises quite some questions. It's pretty much understandable why Auschwitz is so popular. It is really essential for the Holocaust memory. However, it's also essential as a tourist destination, which again kind of brings us back to the whole question about what logic guides the algorithmic outputs. Is the algorithm prioritizing Auschwitz because it can sell better, because it's easy to sell tickets to the Auschwitz than, for instance, to the Treblinka or to the Terezin, or is it because it is actually important for our collective memory? There's also quite some other problematic aspects. For instance, if you're actually looking at the distribution of the camp, you actually almost do not see any Eastern Europe related camps except Auschwitz itself. So basically you do not see Sobibor, you see only very few images related to the Majdanek, which again raises question. Does it what it actually means for the understanding of the Holocaust by the people who actually have very little understanding of the Holocaust? Would they only think that, okay, Holocaust only happened in the Auschwitz, there was no Sobibor because actually search engine doesn't return anything to in relation to the Sobibor? What actually tells us about the memory of the people who died in the Sobibor? Are they kind of less voice of the commemoration because algorithms think that Auschwitz sells better? So what it all tells us about the transdisciplinary challenges? Pretty much, we're definitely having a lot of challenges in what we are doing, even while I definitely enjoy working with robots a lot. So one of the major challenges that we're struggling, which is honestly not a new challenge, I think that a lot of people are familiar with this one, is that it's really very hard to find a common ground between the disciplines, especially as Annie noted, between the hard sciences and also the humanities. I would say that in the case of the computer science and humanities, it is particularly very different because we're definitely having very different understanding of methods as well as research goals. Specifically, when we're thinking about the computer science and information retrieval, they're definitely getting very used to work on a concrete problem, for instance, the improvement of the algorithm. However, what we're struggling here in this case, that in order to solve this specific problem, at least formulate this specific problem, we actually need to know what the desired end goal is. So do we actually want the search algorithm to prioritize Auschwitz among all the other search camps? Do we actually want to randomize the outputs related to the Holocaust? Do we actually want to have an equal distribution? Without answering all those questions, which honestly probably not something that is easy to answer for the computer scientists, but something that probably is more relevant to answer for the Holocaust research specialists and curators. We cannot actually construct a better algorithm. We cannot only criticize what we actually have in currently. There's also a problem with the domain knowledge, because we definitely need a certain level of knowledge which is required to evaluate system performance, especially in the case of historical trauma. So for instance, we actually need to reliably identify denialist and non-denialist content, and for instance, be able to identify from which camp the image is coming. And without really trained historians being the part of the team, it's really very hard to do. And it's not really that hard to organize the collaboration between computer scientists and trained historians. And finally, the funding, which is something that Annie as well as Anna already noted. We really need substantial funds in order to design and also maintain our robot-based infrastructure. But unfortunately, there are not so much mechanisms which actually finance this highly transdisciplinary research, which is located in between the humanities and psychology, as well as the computer science on the other side. Still, I'm definitely very much agreeing with what Annie and Anna said. There is definitely a lot of promise with building trauma studies as transdisciplinary hub. And definitely, I would say that information retrieval can also find some place in this hub. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for outlining this for us with so much clarity and depth. I'm sure that will be, all of those interventions will be followed by questions, but we hold off with the questions for now. And I'm going to invite our fourth speaker, Fiona. Please come on in.
Oh, kia ora koutou, ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. I hope you can see my screen now. And so I'm going to be approaching this a little bit different, but on the same issues that have been raised, studying trauma, and the paper I submitted, Indigenous Healing, Talking Historical Trauma through Māori Development. And before I start, here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we always mihi and we greet, and these are just two of our marae that from my tribal areas. To the left of your screen is the Ngāti Raukawa, and you mentioned that earlier, Magdalena, we've just completed probably last year 5 years of history of tribes and our sub-tribes within that area that has hundreds of pages and documentations recording trauma throughout, but in various narratives from our people. And on the other side with the little whale on top is my Ngāti Parausa, my Ngāti Kunuhi is my mother's. So my father to the left is Raukawa, Ngāti Whakatere, and my mum's the one that shows a whale, which if those who've seen the movie The Whale Rider, so that's where I descend from, those tribal areas. And just outlining how quickly I'll go through the kōrero today is, what does trauma mean for us as Māori people? Introduce the concept of Māori development. Throughout this, I'll weave through the impact of colonisation to Māori as individuals and their families, how trauma is invisible in historical and contemporary literature, stories and narratives, and then how we go about restoring it and the implementation of a multicultural process. And I add in here one of our most esteemed and formidable Māori Indigenous academics, Sir Mason Jury, and his 4 stages of Māori development, and I add in a 5th stage. And also part of my background is I'm a registered social worker within Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we ran that registration through the government, and I'm also in the College of Humanity and Social Science. So moving through, I'll just go to our next slide. And I'll use some of our words in it, that's to bring our voices through and what we understand trauma to be. So for Māori, the concept of trauma is understood in different ways and experienced by our people who continue to be victims of colonisation, discrimination and racism. It has also manifested itself through high rates in statistics for ill health, low educational achievement, high imprisonment rates, negative stereotyping, poverty and extreme economic inequality. And these experiences contribute to intergenerational trauma. And I'm quite fortunate that I have seen and continue to see. I was there at the time of I've seen my grandparents, and my grandfather fought in the First World War, but I didn't get to see him, but I saw my grandmother, my parents' generation, my generation, my children's and my grandchildren's. So seeing through there, not only through the communities and those generations, you get to see how the impact of these things continue to manifest itself throughout these generations. And when looking at trauma, especially, it's very historical, because when we look back at our people, they didn't use that terminology. But it's written in various ways through colonizing processes, assimilating into the education, into the health systems, but also the discriminative policies that come all the way through, and discriminative legislation that still appears today. So all these, it's a continued, but because that word trauma isn't used throughout that historical narrative, it's like it didn't exist. And most of ours who do try and approach or take redress to the Crown for breaking treaties, a lot of the way in which it is written is justifying and that what we experience occurred. But once again, that their terminology isn't as evident as it is now in the more contemporary sort of narratives. And it's about, what happened in terms of our people being disempowered, in which their experiences become removed, and it become removed right in the stories and the narratives and their voices, because once the experiences are removed, then the narratives are removed. And then the sanitation of our trauma you know, in comparison to, you know, still you have that narrative, others lost more than you, other countries have suffered more. And, you know, you still have your language, because a lot of our people still have the Indigenous native language. And when we compare it against, that means that what we've experienced is less than any other Indigenous group, or their hurt and what has happened to them. And also the experience climate trauma, our food sources. I drive, and when we're out of lockdown, because we're in lockdown level 3 in Auckland at this moment. But as I would pass, there's this, it's like a big sort of a pond that on the way to the university, and that used to be the food beds of the tribes that were there. But now, once the colonization, the populations grew of a lot of non-Māori, they started pouring their sewage in there, so they, you know, their food beds were taken. That is right across Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's taken once again, sanitised down for the common good, for the greater population. And through all those, the trauma of silencing narratives like legislated teachers to beat Māori children who spoke their native tongue, and those are ones like my mother, who's grew up with that type of trauma, but it's not written in our stories like that. It is something that we had to live through, and the names, our names of naming our children changed, because when you're in education systems and they can't pronounce the Māori name, and we're colonised by British, the British names they prefer, and they started calling our people that. So within that narrative too, within those experiences, within that loss, the loss of our language, the loss of our identity and who we'd be called. So in moving forward, how do we start to restore this? And I put in here, healing Mother Earth, because a lot of us, in terms of both, you know, my intergenerational, the earth, the environment was sustenance, and we grew in what was beside that and worked alongside that. And if you're going to start, how do we heal it? We start to need looking at that, and implementing our own cultural frameworks to help us through, because we've had a lot of westernized frameworks, and the problems continue, and they will continue until we start doing more than just cut and pasting them into our studies or what we do. Really make you know, give more integrity and honesty to why we bring them forward. And that's when I think about Māori development. It's a historic, holistic development. We look at all those things, economic, political, and social, because a lot of the narratives you'll hear of they're talking about a history always focus on our social. They little bit on our economic, but you hardly see our leadership coming through, and what was that political development all the way through. And that's where I changed to Mason, who talks about, and I come post 1900 because there's a lot of stories behind, but we need somewhere we can start where our generations understand today. And a lot of our stories are covered within that historical context, what we call the Waitangi Tribunal. So we have there the Crozier stage from war, depopulation, and land loss. How do we record our narratives? What's been put in place to help us work forward? Where are we positioned in knowing those stories today? So we call that whakamauitanga. Tupunga Ahu Whenua is a stage 2 where Māori incorporate traditional ways into rural development of farming the land. A lot of good things happened there. There was economic and politics. And we still try today to bring that through, taking on board a lot of what's happened, but still continue forward in a more positive and healing way. Hekinga mai kainga, Māori move in masses to urban areas, leaving their rural areas. What is the traumas all throughout these stages? Because those are still unwritten stories. And there's a lot of trauma when our people start to leave their rural places where they had a lot of support from the tribes, and they end up in the urban areas, overhoused, unemployed, trying to make better lives for their people. And then the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed with the government in 1840, which gave us rights that have ever since we've been fighting for them, to be restored, and highlighting the breaches. And where does that settle? Where are we today with those? There are some settlements. One of my tribes, the one that I just spoke about on my father's side, we're going through tribunal claims now, and it's a lot of work shown through legislations, through stories. This justifies why we should be compensated, we should be given back, we should be acknowledged for what has been done to us. And then this is where I put in the post-millennium, is reviewing this trauma through these stages and that terminology, and having a look through our stories and where that serves, and it does, it's not always written in that cyber terminology. So when pulling that all together, how do we, what's the healing towards that? And I'd say you start by breaking the historical practice that perpetuate trauma on Indigenous communities. And one of those is set not Indigenous authors continuing to write our stories and only cherry picking what is important, but get to the people and ask them, was you will perpetuate another framework that won't work. Give a voice to economic, political and social Indigenous narratives, establish Indigenous platforms and spaces to speak. So thank you very much for giving us a platform to speak today. I really appreciate it. And I know for all those communities are saying, we would really appreciate getting heard again, And I've been so impressed with what I've heard from the panel. A voice like this inside your stories, and uphold the acceptance of Indigenous complexity, push back on homogeny. We continue to be, try and make this will fit your, we are not a one size fits all, and it's okay. What are other ways to deal with all the other sizes? And reinforce healing Indigenous Māori people as healing Māori whānau. Embrace the collective narratives, because the individual is not the individual alone. The individual is part of the group. And when you're healing, you heal the group. And when I'm fortunate here as a social worker in Aotearoa New Zealand, we recognise that. We don't take the individual out and work with them and then put them back in, because the whole family is part of that healing. And in the final words, just let us, in terms of Indigenous voice, think, speak, and let us be Indigenous. Let us be Māori, because very times you get in a lot of these sorts of academic discussions, and your voice starts to get squashed or changed to fit another narrative. And it's usually a Western narrative that isn't your Indigenous narrative. And it's always good if we can allow us that space to think and talk. And just to acknowledge Anna, Annie, Michaela, Magdalena, Lorena, and everybody in Zoom and my university where I'm from. So thank you all very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and everybody for your interventions. I think, one thing that perhaps I could say that I'm finding incredibly striking about these 4 thought-provoking interventions is that you all have done such an excellent job in mapping out and documenting the richness in originality of where the field of trauma studies is today. So I really want to, congratulate you, and with that also open for questions from the audience. I have also a set of questions, but I want to invite everybody in the room to either indicate that you would like to speak if you want to speak, or if you're more comfortable with writing your question in the chat forum. That is also, of course, a possibility, and I will read it out. So the first person on the list is Paul. Paul, please very much, welcome very much, and to ask a question.
Could the panelists define what they mean by trauma? What the word actually means? Because I think there's some quite lazy thinking going on, not here, but in the academic world generally, about what it actually means.
Paul, thank you. So I'll jump in here, affirming that we all see at times quite lazy, as you call it, lazy thinking in conversations where people are pointing to trauma and perhaps sharing research on trauma, or even in social media, in media, mainstream media. I've said before that it's not at all uncommon, as you know, no doubt, that any person will say, oh, I was so traumatized by X, right? That person didn't show up for that meeting we were going to have, and it was just traumatizing, or sometimes quite big things. When I'm speaking of trauma, my working definition is really based around some of the original thinking, original to trauma studies, I think, of scholars like Kathy Caruth and Flora Keshkagian, who's situated with the memory studies, and others, Shoshana Feldman, who point to trauma as unspeakable, which I would argue has perhaps not been accurate, but trauma as a break of sorts, of disconnection in time, where nothing moves forward. One's memory is compromised and challenged. I think when Anna was referring to frozen current, I think that's an excellent way of phrasing it, for sure. And I think that all points to what trauma is. We can talk about traumatic events, we can talk about trauma, but I think we're really talking about processing when we get to an individual level of something that's horrific or violent, or we have a near proximity to death, either our own or those around us. So that's what I think of. But I am certainly aware that it's often a term that's tossed around without much thought. I'm going to mute myself because someone's knocking at my door. So carry on.
All right. Anybody else on the panel would like to step in at this point?
Yeah, I just would like to say very shortly that I define trauma for myself like it's an injury that one cannot handle, be it an individual or a community, and when the coping strategies are just not enough. And it might not be very obvious firstly, but later it can resurface and cause symptoms and even lead to PTSD. But the main thing is to get back to the track when there are new coping strategies, resilience, which can help heal the trauma. That's for me. Yeah.
Yes. Fiona?
Yes, and I'll add to that, and I use the children as an example because when your language and you're educated in the school and your teacher beats you for speaking your language and constantly tells you all the time that that's wrong, that's bad, you shouldn't, in yourself, and it could be a frozen time, you start to think you're no longer good enough, that how you are isn't, and you carry that for years, and it starts to manifest itself where you start to forego who you are as a person. You start to try and find who they are perpetuating. This is what you need to look like, and that's what scaffolds you aim for, and that is that trauma, and it continues to families and generation. It continues to be, and it's that what I'm talking about, and that's just in an education sense. There's a whole lot of other different parts of a society for a race that's been colonized where these things perpetuate itself. And it can be like Michaela was talking about online, when there's constant running down and saying to people, you're not good enough. So that's where I'm coming from when I talk about, and because we're quite a small group, and I mean not a short time, we don't have time to go through the definitions. So I see a lot of people trying to go for the broader sense. So I just wanted to put that there, why those definitions never came through, because it's that assumption that I would say when I would be that the definition. So let's go straight to the main key points that we have 10 minutes to talk about. Kia ora.
Yes. Nicola, did you also want to come in at this point?
No, but I just can very briefly tell that my understanding is very close to what Annie was actually defining as trauma. So I guess I will just give more time for the question.
Okay, and Joanna has also contributed in the chat, so I encourage everybody to read her intervention. And Samer, would you like to come in with your question, please?
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Magdalena. I wanted to bring a question to the floor, but a question with a reflection into all, and the poll question just now, which he made before, it was about the definition of the trauma. And what Anna just said, that she defined trauma as a moment of a break. And so my question is for Anna and for Mikkel more, it's about both of them. When the trauma generates hate in the historical moments in the group, and when that moment of break, the trauma generates a hopelessness or helplessness. Okay, in that moment, because Anna talked about the Civil War, when in Civil War, English Civil War, Spanish Civil War, or any civil war in the world, in the history, when that Civil War memory generates hate in the group. So what is the paper of this trauma? What do you think about what we can do with this kind of memory, with this memory, those who stand with and stand against that trauma? What we can generate this, because also we have trauma. The post-colonialism is trauma. Colonialism is trauma. There is silencers trauma, and there is trauma. For example, in Spain, now it is there's people who are standing for colonialism, and there's the debate of the trauma, if colonialism generates trauma or not. So what is the paper of this trauma? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Anyone wants to? Any, please.
I know that Samer, you mentioned what I had been saying about the Civil War context. Civil wars are historically, certainly in the 17th century, they're viewed as a perversity, an obscenity. One does not fight against oneself. If there's any sense of a single identity for a group, a culture, a society, to fight against oneself is obscene. So in what I have found, just in that one historical context, is that if there's hate that's generated, and there is, it's hate for, or hate directed towards those around you who abandon, I would argue, higher imperatives for men and soldiers in that society. So honor, for example. So I know one bit of narrative that I look at are the recollections of prisoners of war during that Civil War. And when I'm reading about the torture that they underwent as prisoners of war, the really horrific conditions in which they were forced to live, I'm reading their words, which point to really awful, horrific, dehumanizing circumstances. The hatefulness that they're directing towards anyone are the prison keepers, the jail keepers, those who they claim are at fault for creating these horrific situations in which they're forced to live. And in that context, they're focused on the lack of this higher priority for humanity in their world, which is honor, right? One acts with honor. So they seem to accept quite well that someone could be on the opposite side. They don't hate them for being on the opposite side. They expect honorable behavior, even from one's enemy. So in that context of civil war, this perversity, the obscenity that it is, they're focused on that. So that's just an example of a historical handling of what we would consider to be traumatic circumstances, trauma-producing circumstances, the dehumanization that goes on with imprisonment. So I hope that gives you some sense of how historically it's handled in this really awful circumstance. We see that changes over time. If we look at the American Civil War, we look at other civil wars, hate has a place, unfortunately, and it's not caught up necessarily in this larger narrative of one must be honorable at all times, even one's enemy can be honorable. Yeah, and what I'll point to also is that there's a common ingredient of trauma producing events, which is dehumanization. You remove the humanity of the person, and that in itself creates this mental break processing that I'm sure is prevalent, as Fiona will point to, across generations, trying to place that dehumanized reality somewhere, and so on. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Neha has written a question, so I might bring this one in, and then the other panelists feel free to either relate to Neha's or Samer's question. So Neha asks, how relevant are trauma studies in bringing about systemic change in an era of misinformation and conspiracy theory? And then added, in fact, dehumanization is an active ingredient. Yeah. So would anybody else like to come in, either on Neha's point or Samer's?
Yeah, if I can. I probably would respond mostly to the summary, but probably also what I'm going to tell would also applicable to Neha's question. So I would say that both are excellent points. And probably my particular perspective is very different from what Fiona, Annie, and Tana is working with, because from the information retrieval perspective, we're mostly dealing with the consequences of the trauma. So information retrieval itself is not that often the cause of the trauma, even while it can lead to the real traumatization. But what it pretty much often deals with is the reproduction of the dehumanization. Because basically, if our algorithms are really not working as they should be, then they can pretty much just reproduce the dehumanizing narratives, denialist narratives, pretty much hate speech narratives. And there are definitely instances when we know that they actually work like this, which is a major problem. In terms of what we can actually deal with, this one is a very complex question, which would probably very much different on how you actually understand both the trauma and what should be the way of dealing with the trauma. Because currently, for instance, we're trying to think about how we can define algorithmic fairness in relation to the traumatic content. And we're honestly quite struggling with it a lot, because what is fair, for instance, in the representation of, let's say, Rwandan genocide? Do we want, for instance, represent the mainstream narrative? Do we actually want to give also floor to the revisionist narratives, which can be argued that, okay, if you really want to hear and listen to both sides, you also want to give floor to the revisionists. Even while, from the point of view of the victims, it's probably not what you actually want to give, because they're actually denying that victims were victims of the genocide. So pretty much, I would say that it's definitely a question that I do not think that the only person can answer. I definitely think it's something that the community of both researchers, but also the community of victims should answer. And pretty much, I can imagine that depending on the specific instance, we might actually need to have a fine-tuned answer, because not all cases of the trauma, not all cases of the mass atrocities, which are our main focus, are the same. There are definitely different cases, as well as different forms of the traumatization. So what I would say is that probably really the most important point that has to be achieved at the current point of time is actually rising it into the pressing issue, because at least when we're looking at what technical companies are doing, what the tech giants are doing, they pretty much, I would say, very commonly ignoring the whole aspect of the traumatization in relation to the algorithmic systems. In order to actually change something, we actually need to make them stop ignoring the specific point, and then we can actually think, okay, what should actually be the ideal information-driven system that can actually help us to deal with trauma in a productive sense. It can be something, for instance, informed by the peace journalism, when we're actually trying to, I would say, omit the trauma, the information about the mass atrocity or highly traumatizing information in order to build consensus. It can actually be something that actually focuses on informing the society about the mass atrocity and actually raises awareness about the suffering of the victims in order to prevent the suffering in the future. So I would say it's definitely something that we should to think much more than we're currently thinking about, because without actually defining those specific criteria, we cannot build algorithmic systems, unfortunately. We really need those in order to be able to translate it into the code. And because of this, we actually probably need to start as a humans into defining the trauma and well as how we're actually processing the trauma.
Thank you so much. I mean, it was an excellent discussion.
Thanks. Thank you, Naha. Anna or Fiona, would you like to come in at this point?
Yeah, I just would like to add one thing to what Nicola said. So trauma studies, one of the tasks of trauma studies is to raise awareness of trauma, but not as an overarching principle or something that explains a lot of things, but to draw attention to the element of trauma in different events or happenings or phenomena, and then develop or help develop policymakers trauma conscious policies or make trauma informed decisions. So where there are legal issues, where different policies about education, health, and also, yes, internet use or computer science, then being trauma informed gives a different perspective. And that's an approach that we can promote with transdisciplinary trauma studies. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
I think that one aspect that comes up currently, we referred to this a day or two ago when we met briefly, and many, I think, are aware, certainly in North America and the United States, is that there are now in the congressional settings in the United States, whistleblowers. One whistleblower came forward, somebody who came forward about Facebook, and was really talking about alleging Facebook's use of its platforms, because it's more than one, as we know, and perpetuating knowingly information sharing themes and tropes and posts, and allowing for the posting and sharing of information and entertainment type items that actually had a great impact in one case on young women who are teenagers around food and eating. And the fact that there's an assertion that this entity knew that it was doing that, knew that its algorithms were pointing a vulnerable population or an influential, a population that is easily influenced in certain directions. So where does that put us, though? Does the fact that we know that these larger entities are willingly or knowingly engaging us in these habits and these trajectories, does that change? Does it forward a policy overall, or a commitment on the part of everyone to try harder to work to inform everyone about the nature of trauma? I think it's a step in that direction. Anna was speaking about social policy. I think it's certainly important that people engage in trauma studies in a larger sense, and in their own individual small little areas, always have some awareness that there's much to say and much to share with those who don't do trauma studies, those who are not academic, those who are not in Indigenous communities, and therefore don't really have a sense of how it operates. It's imperative that we make statements, that we cross the divide between us knowing what we know and, say, governments and policymakers, and speak to them so that we're pushing forward trauma awareness, trauma understanding, comprehension of it. And we know it's difficult. I mean, you just see from the diversity of presentations here, right? From Fiona to Nicola to me to Anna, if we're just a small group, right? So you can see how diverse it is and where everybody's situated. It's certainly difficult to have a single statement, but I think we must.
Yes, absolutely. I'm aware that we are running out of time, or we have. I wanted to ask Fiona whether you wanted to come in on any of those two questions or the contributions by your fellow panelists.
Yes, I'd support my fellow panelists and make it small, giving it a voice. By giving it a voice, like I said in mine, the term was not used in a lot of the historical narratives of our people. When we take our cases to government, it's seldom used the term because there's so much other things that we are trying to put through, but it's new to look in that way. Instead, people will talk about their experience. We won't call it frozen in time. They will say, because I was hurt, this is what happened. And in order to get that voice to then be turned into a policy that can address those things, it needs to be worked in some way that brings it from there to be useful, to give it a voice so our people get recognised for what they experienced and acknowledged, and then redressed and time to heal. Other than it will continue to be perpetuated generations. And adding to that, as I said, I had that 5 generational perspective. What my grandparents experienced is very different from what my grandchildren and my grandchildren I see on those, as you were talking there, Nicola, how they're going to be seeing themselves is going to be played out a lot on Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. And it's a different world, but that's not the term used in all those. Neither is it studied in that type of theoretical foundation. So that's my contribution to the discussion.
Thank you so much. So I think I might bring this to a close, thanking everybody for participating, thanking again our 4 panelists. There is going to be a recording of that event that you might want to revisit. Yes, so hopefully we will have a chance to continue these conversations. Thank you so much. Have a good day and good night.
Thank you, Magdalena.
Thank you for sharing, Magdalena.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Oops.
I think we're the only ones here.